Alright, in this video I'm going to walk you through a real case study and show you how you can use the Life Values Alignment Grid as a practical tool to make sense of what's happening fast. So this is based on a real client I worked with. I've changed the identifying details, but the themes and outcomes are real, and I think you're going to get a lot out of this video. So Brian is 55. He's hardworking, lives in regional Australia and works in a factory. He also has to travel away from home quite regularly. He's pretty quiet by nature and reserved, but he comes to me with something really common. He says, "I'm having trouble with my relationship and I don't really know what my role is." He cared a lot about his partner, so it wasn't a lack of love situation. It was more like he felt misunderstood. Conflict was rising and he was getting defensive. And if you've ever worked with men like this, or honestly anyone like this, you'll know the vibe. Of course, they're not bad people, they're just stuck. They're often reliable, stable, and loyal. But when emotions and conflict show up, they quickly retreat into self-protection mode. And that's what was happening here for Brian. So here's how we can review this case using the grid. The first step is to find the pattern first, not so much the story. So when Brian came in, the story could have been communication issues. But the pattern tells a different story. He was getting defensive during conflict. He'd self-criticize a lot. He would struggle to express his emotions. And he'd sometimes withdraw or get frustrated. So as a practitioner, I'm not trying to diagnose him or give him a label. I'm trying to locate him on the grid. Because once we can locate him, we can give him a pathway back to center. So let's now take a look at the grid and map his drift. So if I place Brian on the grid, he wasn't sitting neatly in one quadrant. He was moving around, and that's quite normal. So his common drift looked a bit like this. The first pattern of drift was to the enforcer quadrant. There was an energy and frustration under pressure when things felt tense. He'd go into, "I need to fix this, I need to hold it together" mode. And that's the over-responsibility quadrant. It's not necessarily loud or aggressive. Sometimes the enforcer is quiet, rigid, and internal. And it can show up as trying to be right, or tightening up emotionally, or being controlling, and through logic as well, getting critical, even subtly, and resentment tends to build. So in relationships, enforcer often looks like, "I'm trying and they're not," or it's a power and control dynamic. The next drift was to the deflector quadrant, and that's when he shut down and goes quiet. It gets too much. So after enough tension, after enough conflict, after enough stress, he'd drop. He'd withdraw and go flat and feel like giving up. And he'd say, "What's the point?" So that's deflector territory. So his pattern was a little bit like this. He'd try harder, and then things would get tense, they'd get defensive, and then he'd withdraw and feel guilty and feel down and flat. And the cycle would repeat, and he would try harder again. And so that's a really common cycle, but the grid gives you the language for it and the visualization so you can see it. And it does that without shaming. So the next step is to use values to rebuild the center. Not so much to fix the partner or anything like that, but to rebuild the center. So here's the turning point. We didn't start by fixing the relationship with a whole new set of skills. We started by helping Brian understand himself better and that's a center of health move. We explored his values, and what came through strongly was things like awareness, family and connection, communication, bravery, balance, kindness, trust, integrity, adventure, and curiosity. Now, this is the part I want you to notice as a coach. Those values are basically a map back to center. Because center isn't a mood, it's a way of being. And those values give you the ingredients of that way of being for your client. So instead of working on stop being defensive as a behavior, what we worked on was things like, what kind of man do you want to be here? What matters to you more than winning the argument in this moment? What values do you want guiding you when things get tense? Now that's why values work is so powerful. It bypasses shame and goes straight to identity and direction. Okay, the next step. It's a simple grid-based coaching sequence that you can copy. So here's the rough process. And you can, copy this for your own sessions. So the first step is to ask, where are you right now on the grid? And not as a label or anything like that, but as a check-in. So when conflict starts, where do you drift? Is it towards the enforcer quadrant or more deflector? So this step alone builds awareness. And now the next step is to ask, what are the behaviors in that quadrant? And so for Brian, it was things like defensiveness and self-criticism, withdrawing, frustration, and emotional shutdown. And again, this is not judging, this is just naming what was going on. And third is, what is the cost of staying here? And this is key. So when we talk about cost, this helps get buy-in. It's the pain they want to move away from at all costs. So for Brian, the cost was disconnection in his relationship, a misunderstanding. There was more conflict and less trust, and he was feeling like he was failing as a partner. And fourth, now we have, what does the center look like for you specifically? And so the center has to become personalized. It's about visualization now. And so for Brian, the center wasn't to be super emotional or anything like that. The center was more like being calm under pressure, having integrity, and doing small but meaningful moments of connection, and practicing communication that fits his style, and being brave in vulnerability. So that's huge for quieter men. Bravery isn't shouting out feelings from the rooftop or anything like that. Bravery is staying present even when things get tough. And so fifth is asking questions like, which values will help guide your return to center? And this is where we directly use his values list. So for example, the first one, awareness. This is where noticing the defensive surge early. You can have that awareness around that. Bravery is staying in the conversation instead of shutting down or calling out a timeout respectfully. Kindness, that's about softening the tone even during a disagreement. So these are all little mini actions you can take based on your values. Another one, communication, it's about being honest and using helpful ways of communicating instead of withdrawing. And trust and integrity for Brian, so this is about him being consistent and clear in his actions. And another one, balance. So for Brian, this is about not overdoing it or taking control, and nor is it about collapsing down. So you can almost sense the pathway here just by talking through these few things. So it's not about being different, it's more about aligning with your purpose and connecting with that vision, taking those actions. So step 5, the actual intervention. This is where the micro wins come in. It's not about replacing your personality or anything like that. And this is one of the big breakthroughs for Brian, one of his big moments. This was about lowering that defensiveness and separating behavior from identity. And that's all center of health work, because shame lives in the quadrants. Center is all about, I can own this without beating myself up. So we came up with things like, when you feel that defensive surge, let's just pause and sit with it. Be guided by your values and do one small thing that is going to help instead. So even simple stuff like doing chores together, but using it as connection time, not silence time, that became a practice for this couple, and it became a ritual of connection. So these are all examples of micro wins and micro steps to help your client rebuild and strengthen their identity, and in this case was about improving Brian's relationship. And so the next step here is about the vision and locking that vision in. As we touched on just a little bit earlier, the vision helps anchor the goals and builds that shared vision to get that buy-in. So Brian imagined his future, which was around camping and traveling and spending the golden years with his partner and having that warmth and laughter in the relationship. And that matters because values without a future can just become moral pressure, and that's not helpful here. So values tied to that meaningful vision become an intense motivation. So this pulls someone like Brian toward center naturally. Okay, let's look at some results and client outcomes and why you as a coach or counselor should care here. You see, by the end, Brian had more emotional insight. He was able to set and communicate healthier boundaries. He had more openness and more consistency, and there was less defensiveness. And importantly here, he didn't become a different person. He just became a more aligned and grounded version of himself. So if you're a coach, a counselor, or therapist, and you're watching this, here's the key takeaway. The grid helps you do 3 things fast. First is to spot the drift without blaming the client. Second is you can name the quadrant behaviors without diagnosing or shaming. And third, you can create a clear pathway back to the center using values and small helpful actions. Now that's how you get clients unstuck and making progress towards their goals, by simply locating where they are, naming what's going on, and getting them moving again, doing the things that matter most. Okay, so let's wrap this video up. If you want a simple guide that you can use for yourself or with clients, then go ahead and grab the free Life Values Alignment Grid Guide from my website. There's a link for you below. And if you're a practitioner and you want the full set of tools, including all the exercises and the wider framework, I encourage you to explore the Life Values Method Practitioner Kit on my website. All right, I'll see you in the next video.